We will just wait a couple of minutes more until the top of the hour. I think we can start very much on time. Thanks for everybody who is joining us already. I think we're really in for a treat and a very interesting presentation. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes if more people want to join so that they can join. Make yourself comfortable. Hi, Michael. Good to see you.
Yes, I recognize him.
Yeah, and he has the video on, so it's actually seeing him. That's why I mentioned it.
You've got your mute on, Mike.
And we still can't hear, unfortunately.
Yeah, it looks like your voice isn't working, Michael.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the microphone.
Maybe it's the microphone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Well, thank you for all your hard work putting this together.
Thank you. You're welcome. It's a pleasure. So now it's top of the hour. So I think we're good to go and ready to start. Again, a very warm welcome to Dr. Rodney Dieser. Dieser? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't ask before.
Almost everyone says it backwards. You did it right.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, a very warm welcome to you and to all of you who joined this session. I will just do a little bit of housekeeping before. So I would kindly ask you to put yourself on mute during the presentation. We will have a Q&A session after the presentation, and then of course you're very welcome to unmute yourself and ask your questions directly, but you can also put them into the chat, and I will keep an eye on that and forward the questions. So that's one thing, and the other thing, you might have already seen it in the chat. There is a translation available through Wordly. You can use the link that I provided in the chat. The presentation will be held in English, but if you're more comfortable to have it translated to a different language, you can do this by using the Wordly link in the chat box. So I think that's all for housekeeping for now, and I just want to tell you that the session is recorded. So if you're not comfortable with yourself being seen on video, I would kindly ask you to turn off your camera. Otherwise, we are more than happy to see you. And with this, I want to hand it over to our presenter, Dr. Rodney Dieser. Thanks for being here, and looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, well, before everyone entered the room, I mentioned to Savina how much I appreciated her and the committee, and it's a tremendous amount of work. And I know that from committee work I've done on other, not in logotherapy. So I appreciate all your work, and I appreciate very much being here. And so just a little bit about myself, and then I'll get into the actual presentation so I can contextualize this historically. So I'm a professor that teaches at the University of Northern Iowa. I teach in 2 different departments, but I'm also a licensed mental health counselor that works about 10 hours in the community. And my passion has always been studying leisure. And that goes back to my own childhood, right? And my childhood was one with a mother who had cancer, who died when I was a senior in high school. And, my parents didn't handle it well. My parents were both from what they called the old country. My mom from Hungary, my dad from Germany, and they didn't handle it well. They didn't talk about it. And, I ended up at the gym. So I ended up actually on the Canadian national powerlifting team, though I never actually competed at a national competition, but I qualified. And that gym became my home. I mean, that gym became a sense of community to help me deal with, escaping the high stress and the pain in my home and so forth. And these really rugged guys, we really developed a sense of a closeness and a sense of community and so forth. And I would say that weightlifting is what really propelled me to be the person I am today, a professor who studies leisure and a therapist that has a lot of wellness aspects that I put into counseling. So I so deeply believe in leisure and counseling. And then, I decided, it was just, I don't know what it was, 4 or 5 years ago. I was looking for where should I go get some continuing education credits. And I thought, you know what, I want to learn more about logotherapy. Enrolled in the Institute, and Cindy was my teacher, and it just resonated with me at such a deep level. So I've tried to merge these now, this concept of leisure and what Frankl wrote about it. 2 years ago, I presented here, and it was on leisure, but it was kind of the opposite of what I'm going to teach now. What I did 2 years ago was I was looking at the theories of leisure, and I was trying to make them fit. And now I've had enough time to go through Frankl's writings and to really, really look at the concept of leisure, the way Frankl wrote about it. So this presentation today really is a contextual analysis of historical sources. It's an initial historical exploration. And there's a research purpose, or the question is, or the aim really is to bring to light Frankl's views on the concept of leisure in 2 areas. One, his writing, but also what he lived as leisure. And if you've looked at the objectives, these are 2 of the 3 objectives, right? Understanding leisure from Frankl's writings, understanding his lived leisure. And then the third one is future directions in counseling practice and research. So this is what we would call the sample frame. These are the 5 books. And when I went through, initially the Institute to be credentialed with a diplomate, I read it to understand. I wasn't like deeply searching for leisure. And that was always on my radar because I study leisure. But, 2 years ago when I presented, I have really different views on Frankl's leisure than I did 2 years ago. But these were the 5 books. That's why it's an initial exploration. Maybe in 2 years at the next Congress, I've read another 5 or 6 Frankl books and I can add to it and so forth. Why did I pick these 5 books? Well, the first 3 serve as the essential Frankl's writings on logotherapy, and Cindy Wimberly, helped me on some of this. I want to give due where it's should be given. The Doctrine of the Soul is Frankl's first comprehensive development, writing about logotherapy. Man's Search for Meaning opens up the world to his theory, and then The Will to Meaning expands his critical concepts. I added these 2 books, Frankl's Recollections, for obvious reasons. It's his autobiography. And then I added Yes to Life. And that's because Yes to Life, in my mind, was still part of that, even though it was published in English just a few years ago. It was the lectures that Frankl really gave that really created the foundation for Man's Search for Meaning. So it goes back to those sort of original 3 books. And so I think most of you know these 2. Who is Viktor Frankl? I did wonder, maybe there will be a few people who are not credentialed or just starting or just interested, right? He's the founder of logotherapy. But this one I want to sort of emphasize, and it'll become more clear toward the end of the presentation. Frankl is also an amazing writer. I mean, I don't know what you could say other than prolific. I mean, he wrote 691 articles, and I think almost all of those were on a typewriter. Now imagine that. I've written about 130 articles, but I have a copy and paste function. So sometimes when I write them, I can copy and paste some stuff and then, sort of change it around. Now I started school, high school and college on a typewriter. I just think that's so amazing. Like, just think about that. And then, he's written over 30 books, and I have written 7. And that is just an amazing amount of work, right? Now, less than a tenth of Frankl's writings have been translated into English, so sort of keep that in mind as I move along. So, let me tell you how Frankl uses the concept leisure. In The Doctor and the Soul, Frankl actually uses the word leisure. That's the actual word he uses. And he outlines that when work is viewed as a means to an end, not connected to purpose or life or so forth, that someone can find or discover meaning through leisure. And he provides a case study in it where the case study is a person who's unemployed. His terminology is the person's dealing with unemployment neurosis. I think it's contemporary DSM language. We'd probably call that depression. And he writes about how this person used their leisure to discover meaning in life. So where some people might, do a lot of self-talk, they're no good, and so forth, because they're unemployed. He provides this case study. And this is what he says. This is what Frankl writes, right? There's another sort of unemployed person who, forced to live under the same adverse economic conditions as the unemployed neurotic, nevertheless, remains free of unemployment neurosis. He seems to be rather apathetic nor depressed. Seems, in fact, to retain a certain cheerful serenity. Why should this be? If we examine the matter, we discover that such persons have put themselves to work elsewhere when they do not have their regular jobs. For example, they're busy as voluntary assistants in various organizations and adult education classes, serving as unpaid helpers in public libraries. They form the habit of attending lectures and hearing good music. They are reading a good deal and discussing what they've read with their friends. If they are young people, they're active in youth clubs, take part in community athletics, go to gymnasiums, go on hikes, play games, and so on. Such persons give meaningful form to their surplus of leisure time and stock their consciousness, their time, their life with constant. They have an affirming attitude toward life and are far from hopeless. They know how to lend interest to life and wrest meaning from it. There still remains much room in which man's free spirit can operate. Then we have Frankl's next book, right? His second book, Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl does not use the term leisure in this book, but he reports on activities that seem pretty leisurely to me, and they're all connected to the meaning triangle, especially the first two. And he reports on how leisure occurred in a Nazi concentration camp. He reports on the songs and the jokes that they do, observing nature in a concentration camp and engaging in art. And Frankl then describes this sort of nexus amongst experience, art, and imagination in activities of self-transcendence. And so here's one of the things he writes about in Man's Search for Meaning. This intensification of inner life, I think he's talking about imagination, helped the prisoners find a refuge from the emptiness, the desolation, and the spiritual poverty of his experience. As the inner life of the prisoner tended to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before. Under their influence, he sometimes even forgot his own frightful circumstances. Earlier, I mentioned art. Is there such a thing in a concentration camp? It rather depends on what one chooses to call art. Now, I've underlined the next thing, and you'll know why in about a slide or two. A kind of cabaret was improvised from time to time. A hut was cleared temporarily. A few wooden benches were pushed or nailed together, and a program was drawn up. They came to the cabaret to have a few laughs, or to perhaps to cry a little, anything to forget. There were songs, poems, jokes, some with underlying satire regarding the camp. All were meant to help us forget, and they did. The gatherings were so effective that a few ordinary prisoners went to see the cabarets in spite of their fatigue, even though they missed their daily portions of food by going. So, one of the things I found when I read Recollections, his autobiography, is Frankl used to do this in his childhood, right? You know, if we go back to Douglas Kleber, who's written a lot about leisure, but is actually trained as a psychologist, spent most of his career at the University of Georgia. He spent his whole career talking about how childhood play is often the forerunner of adult leisure behavior. And you see this in Frankl, where he discloses in his childhood, you know, he was doing the same thing. He was creating the cabarets, right? They were taking wooden planks and putting them together and doing plays and jokes and theatrical sorts of things. And this same sort of thing happens in a concentration camp, where now they're putting together wooden benches instead of wooden barrels, and they're nailing them together and they're creating a stage. One evening, now this is a direct quote also from Man's Search for Meaning. One evening, when we were already resting on the floor of our hut, dead tired, soup bowls in hand, a fellow prisoner rushed in and asked us to run out to the assembly ground and see the wonderful sunset. After minutes of moving silence, one prisoner said to another, how beautiful the world could be, right? And I try to imagine this, right? I try to imagine someone who's starving to death, might be eating a potato a day, and is outside seeing the beauty of a sunset, you know, behind the barbed wire of a concentration camp. So then we have this 23-year span, and Frankl then writes The Will to Meaning. And Frankl now goes and uses very specific language to differentiate different types of leisure. So if you remember, Doctor and the Soul, he was using leisure. No such word happens in Man's Search for Meaning. But he creates a binary theory, and he differentiates very explicitly between centrifugal and centripetal leisure. And centrifugal was problematic to Frankl, right? It was an avoidance technique to prevent an inner awareness to be able to find meaning in life. It was to distract a person away from their noetic conscience or dimension in their consciousness. So their inner voice couldn't detect meaning because they were pursuing these sorts of activities that wouldn't allow some sort of reflective state to hear the inner voice. And Frankl said most people would do this. And all it led to was the existential vacuum. A quote from Frankl: centrifugal leisure is a defense mechanism, an attempt to escape the confrontation with an existential vacuum. Today, centrifugal leisure is prominent. Flight from self allows for avoiding a confrontation with the void in the self. People vacillating between professional overactivity, working too much, and centrifugal leisure have no time to finish their thoughts. And then he juxtaposes it to this: centripetal leisure. And the definition up here, this first one is what I wrote about a few years ago. It's a free time activity dedicated to discovering or engaging in meaning or exploring meaning potentials. Now, Frankl does that too. I just added a few little things like a free time activity. Frankl clearly writes about this and about how centripetal leisure is used to explore meaning potentials and to connect it to this meaning triangle. And the ultimate, I would say the pure centripetal leisure would be then rooted in self-transcendence. And Frankl wrote, centripetal leisure would allow for solving existential problems and to begin with facing them. Leisure, which allow for contemplation and meditation. To this end, man needs courage to be lonely, right? To be able to hear the inner voice and to be able to follow, where the conscience dictates, leads to potential meanings. Yes to Life, the actual title of that book is based on a song that was used that Frankl and all other Jewish prisoners would sing in various concentration camps, which gave them hope. And this seems to be more connected to meaning in the moment than, ultimate meaning or anything like that. And then in that book, Yes to Meaning, Frankl provides this thought experiment. And I thought what was interesting with this thought experiment is it showed how you could have an experience as a spectator watching, but it's also creative activity by the musician. And it's linked to this concept of meaning and beauty. And this is his thought experiment. He says, should I perhaps try to explain for you with some hackneyed phrase how and why experiencing beauty can make life meaningful? I prefer to confine myself to the following thought experiment. Imagine that you are sitting in a concert hall and listening to your favorite symphony, and your favorite bars of the symphony resound in your ears, and you're so moved by the music that it sends shivers down your spine. And now imagine that it would be possible, something that is psychologically so impossible, for someone to ask you in this moment whether your life has meaning. I believe you would agree with me if I declared that in this case, you would only be able to give one answer, and it would go something like this. It would have been worth it to have lived for this moment alone. This is centripetal leisure. It's not called that in Yes to Life. Remember, he doesn't come up with the term later, right? He doesn't come up with it till the will of meaning. Frankl's students, in particular, Anne Graber, Elizabeth Lucas, and Joe Faber, have written about centripetal leisure. Now they just call it leisure, and they call it hobbies, art and nature, right? So one of the things is we have these terms that are sort of weaving around and so forth. It seems to me that Frankl really used the term centripetal leisure, because if you look up what centripetal means, it means this sort of centeredness. But there's different terms. It's called leisure. It's called hobbies by some of his students, being in art, being in nature, creative activities, right? And creativity is part of the meaning triangle. But I think I like the term centripetal leisure. And I think that's where Frankl really, really cemented things in the will to meaning. Now, when we look at Frankl, so that's Frankl's writing. Okay, now if we look at his life, so this is the most obvious one, right? So you can go to the Viktor Frankl website, and it's mountain climbing and it's flying airplanes, right? We heard Dr. Wong say that this morning, pretty early in his presentation, right? Frankl was curious, and he was curious. Dr. Wong didn't say he was curious in his free time, but right off the bat, he, I think one of his first bullet points was curiosity with the mountain climbing and the flying airplanes, and his learning how in the 60s. I'm watching the clock. I'll make sure I'm done at 4:35, so we have 10 minutes worth of questions. Now, in Recollections, in his autobiography, he doesn't call it centripetal leisure. He calls it pleasures and hobbies. And he writes about mountain climbing and flying his airplane, but he calls it now a different thing. And he wrote this in 2000, right? Well, he was published in 2000. He wrote it before, obviously. And, it doesn't call it centripetal leisure. And then I always have a hard time saying Alex's last name. I think it's enunciated Bakany, reported that, before his imprisonment, how deeply involved Frankl was in the mountain climbing. So it's real. I mean, right before he knew he was going to be reporting to a concentration camp, he rips the star off of his shirt and goes climbing for what he knows might be the last time and kisses the rock out of sheer joy. But here's the thing I keep circling around to. Remember, Frankl was this prolific writer. And where does this fit into the whole scheme of things? Was his writing work or was it leisure? I don't know if he was required to do it. I don't know if he had tenure requirements at the University of Vienna. But, here's the thing about the literature about prolific writers. So there's a whole body of knowledge on like academics that really like to write or practitioners that really like to write. I wish Bob was in here because I just listened to Bob's presentation before this. He was talking about how much he loved writing and these stories he was writing. But one of the things that the body of knowledge looks at prolific writers is what their motivation is. And often they're motivated to contribute to society. Often the writing is an act of self-transcendence. They're not writing to make money. I've written 120 articles. Money's not even on the radar. And as Bob was saying in the last presentation, when you write textbooks, it becomes a headache because you end up with all these problems with your taxes and so forth. And Perry and Weiss in their study actually, who interview prolific writers, actually come up with the term of a public service motivation, where researchers are driven to publish by a desire to make a difference in society. And probably the best difference that happens is eventually when those research findings actually become an applied theory and it actually works and people are actually using those theories. And Walker and Felton, they use some different words, but they look at it as, it's creativity, it's serious leisure, but they also reinforce that this is public service. This is serving others in a different way. So I think Frankl's writings were his primary centripetal leisure. I think they were more important to him than his mountain climbing and his airplane flying. And there is a term that's used more in the sociology of leisure, devotee occupations. And these are, some of them blurred, right? When we create that boundary of like, this is work and this is leisure, which a lot of early theories of leisure, have. And even in Frankl's first, quote I gave you from Doctor and the Soul, there's this clear boundary, right? Like this person's unemployed, it's their free time. And, this is their leisure. They're going to the public library. There's a blurred middle area between the dichotomy between the two. Devotee occupation, the line erases. They're doing both. But it's a serious type of leisure. There's a skill set to it. And the sociologist Robert Stebbins from the University of Calgary has written a lot about this concept of serious leisure. And Frankl often shared that his logos in life was to help people discover meaning. Well, we all know he did that as a therapist, but he obviously also did it with his writing. And the other thing I gleaned from this was that Frankl's two writing projects, basically two big writing projects, were all connected to the hell he was living in the concentration camps, right? So when he ends up with typhoid fever and he's, really sick, on his deathbed with typhoid fever, he starts to try to put together the Doctor and the Soul again, right? I mean, he kept that. His manuscript was his child. His writing was his child. And, as I'm sure most of you know, right, he tried to bring that hidden manuscript into the concentration camps and got found out. So now he's sick, and what does he do? He writes. He engages in leisure, and I would say he's engaging in centripetal leisure. And then in Man's Search for Meaning, he tells the story of him having this dream. And this dream is he sees himself in the future as a professor. there's his future logos. And he sees himself in this academic role with this writing and lecturing and being a practitioner. So here's what I found really interesting in all of this. And I'm watching the clock here. I got about 5 minutes or so. So Frankl clearly engages in the mountains. But his writing is deeply connected with that. And I found this quote to be pretty interesting. Frankl wrote, and this is from Recollections, "Until my 80th year, mountain climbing has been my most passionate hobby." I missed a word in there. "My hours spent climbing were the only ones during which I have no thought to my next lecture or book. All of my honorary doctorates do not mean as much to me as the 3 alpine climbing paths named after my honor. The happy moments after completing a book and taking the manuscript to the publisher in the city, then to go to the mountains, climb a sheer rock wall, and spend the night in a mountain lodge with a loved one. I go to the mountains to gather my strength on solitary walks. Every important decision I have made, almost without exception, I've made in those mountains." So there's a nexus there. It's not separate. There's a nexus of his writing and his mountain engagement that is deeply connected to his own logos. So although Frankl did not write at length about leisure, the leisure experience was a foundational part of Frankl's life where meaning could be discovered, and it was clearly connected to logotherapy. Frankl's centripetal leisure engagement, well, it's all blurred. There's mountain climbing, there's nature solitude, there's airplane piloting. You could say that's a serious sort of leisure endeavor. But there's also outdoor solitude. That first bullet point, nature solitude, shouldn't have been in the first. It should have been only in the second. Sorry, I made a mistake. So his outdoor solitude and being with loved ones was more of the casual, but his writing's in there. And I would say it's in the middle of some sort of work leisure nexus. So what are the future directions? Well, from a research perspective, I'm interested in this. I plan on doing this, looking at other Frankl writings in English beyond the 5 books. But one of these days, I plan once, in another couple of years, I've got to wait. And I mean this in the most authentic way. I have an older dog that I love deeply, and I'm not looking forward to the day my dog dies. That will be a very sad day. But once our dog passes away, then I plan to put in a sabbatical or, development leave. And I'd love to go to the Viktor Frankl archives in Vienna and see if someone could help me and look at so much of his writing specifically related to leisure. And, to me, the other future direction, and I want to get moving on this, is to augment how leisure could be, centripetal leisure could be more used in a more intentional way in counseling. Now, I'm very wellness oriented in my intake assessments when I first see clients. So I ask them right out a couple of questions of, what do they do for fun? What's their favorite hobby? I kind of use the miracle question. If you had all this, free time and there weren't financial struggles, what would you do for fun? I mean, what would you just do? And I think we need to be more intentional about looking at what people do in their free times and how much free times. A lot of clients I see, they're not doing centripetal leisure. They're doing centrifugal leisure, right? They're using their leisure to forget. And there's health in distraction. There is health in that. But sometimes there can be too much distraction. We're not using leisure enough where a person could find could connect to the noetic dimension and discover meaning. So I am right on time. It's 4:33. I wanted to end at 35 after. References can be requested from me if you want. I did forget to put my email, but I know it's on the main website of the conference. So I'm curious about your thoughts and any questions that you have.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. And as I said before, you can just unmute yourself and ask any question that you might have or any observation that you might have. So we are happy to take them now.
Well, first of all, Rod, it's great to see you in person here. It's Anne Marie Gill. We've had many conversations on email, and it was a great presentation. I was so excited when I saw this topic. I do want to correct one thing about his typing his manuscripts. He did not type his manuscripts. His lovely wife, Ellie, typed all of his manuscripts. She went with him on every trip he ever made. She typed his manuscripts, and she was always telling him, apparently, when she thought his writing was too complicated, that he needed to make it simpler so people could understand. And one of the ways she was often looked at was the warmth behind the light. So I do need to give a little shout out here to Ellie in terms of all those books that he wrote, because she was a huge part of it and a huge part of his leisure activities in terms of mountain climbing. She learned how to mountain climb so she would be able to spend time with him. And he loved mountain climbing so much that he was still climbing when he had macular degeneration, and and could not hardly see. And she finally begged him to please stop. So she was afraid something would happen to him. So I think I might disagree with you a little bit. I think the mountain climbing was a huge part of his life from the time he was a little boy. And that beautiful story you told, Alexander Batniani told about taking his star off before he was deported. The other part of that story is that it was his friend who was not Jewish who said to him, because you were not allowed to mountain climb at that point if you were Jewish, told him to come with him, that he was taking him somewhere. And when they got to the mountain, he told Viktor Frankl to take his star off. And that was a huge, huge act of love and self-transcendence on the part of this colleague, because had he been caught, they both would have been possibly killed or certainly imprisoned. So I just think that was a huge part of his life, but clearly the writing is too. So I just want to give a shout out. And he used to mountain climb to this little cafe. His friend Joe Fabry said, when he was an older man, and he would climb the mountain, even though it was faster to go up the path. And all the people there did not know, as Frankl said, that he was famous. They just knew he was this little old guy that was climbing the mountain when he could have walked up there. And he loved it because he was able to just be himself and enjoy being around people without having to be Dr. Frankl, the psychiatrist. So beautiful, beautiful presentation.
Thank you. You know, I really, and this is why we present, right? We present to talk to people, and we learn things, and it takes us on another pathway. But I will email you after the conference is done, because I need to know some of the references of the stuff you said, because this has just opened up a whole new pathway, right? Now it's connected to his wife, right? And I would really like to learn more about her thoughts and what she thought about the typewriter, and if they had discussions over the manuscripts, and how that was, I'm going to assume, part of her self-transcendence. And that part you just said at the end, like, I need to find the reference of him showing up at this cafe and everyone just knowing who he was, because that's all part of it, right? Remember, this is an exploratory study. It starts with 5 references. You've been involved in logotherapy way before me, so your knowledge is much, much better than me, but I need to connect with you. One other thing I was going to say, to me, obviously the mountain climbing was key. I'm not saying it wasn't, but I think the writing part has been missed. I think somehow the writing part is viewed more as, well, that might be his work. And that's what I'm questioning. Was it really work? Maybe this was leisure, so that's the part that I'm trying to add to. I'm not in any way suggesting mountain climbing wasn't important, but it seems like the writing was crucially important too. So
Okay, thank you. Bernadette has raised her hand. So
Yeah, I just want to say, Rodney, that I've never heard so much about leisure, and especially from Frankl. And I love how you explored all these different domains, including this writing. I think that's fabulous. And I just want to say from an experiential standpoint that I feel that the mountain climbing, and I'm a big exercise enthusiast, maybe kind of kin to you. You were inspired by your weightlifting, but also myself within being in nature. And it seems like there's this process that goes on, and my deceased husband would say exercise is the elixir because of all these chemical um, uh, reactions that are going on within our body and in our mind. But even beyond that, then when you're doing that exercise in nature, that connection with source or creativity in of itself, nature being, I think, the most creative entity in this universe. But then also the hobby part, which is more man-made, which is creation. And I feel like that's also a different, maybe slightly a different process to explore that takes us also to a place of meaning. And then I think the third dynamic you pointed out was where the work and the leisure converges. I think so many that's I don't know, I'm not very well read, but I don't know if that's been explored in totality. Like I have not had a profession that I want to say was my love, like perhaps my deceased husband. You know, that was calling and also his love. But I adjusted to find meaning in various aspects of it, right? But you've brought up an area of the leisure work that crossover and to help people. I don't know if that's a way to help people discover that. And what is that place where that happens? I just think this was a really tremendous analysis you've done and work you put together. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I want to reach out to you after the conference is over. I know who you are. I'll reach out to you, but you know, it isn't. And you go back to like the area of career counseling or career development, and you look at some of those theories, John Holland, the psychologist that created those Holland codes that U.S. Department of Labor uses. You know, there's a dichotomy, right? I mean, John Holland created this, you know, a leisure finder, 1997. It's a dichotomy. And you go back to Donald Super lifespan, you know, life role model, and that's used in career counseling. It's always separated. And one of the few people who've written about work and leisure. Now he's a prolific writer, Bob Stedman's a sociologist. I think he's published 300 plus articles, as much as Frankl, but a lot, and 30 some books. And he has his Serious Leisure Perspective website. And I know him well. He's at the University of Calgary. I'm originally from Canada, and I went to the University of Alberta, so I met him then. But he's one of the few sociologists who really looked at work and said, it's not that clear. It's blurred, and there is something in the middle. And he calls it devotee employment. And that's what I think Frankl was doing, where their career is both leisure and work, and it might even be more leisurely than work. So I want to keep pursuing it, and I want to talk to you more because you conceptualize that, I think, so well about what happens in nature. And I want to write more about Frankl and nature, and now what our good Anne-Marie has added about, you know, his wife. So thank you for your thoughts.
Rodney, I got a question. In this leisure concept, how related would it be to the kind of the play concept? Like you mentioned kind of Viktor Frankl's play as a child. I guess where in your look at this, where is the overlap there? Are we dealing with something very similar, two different concepts?
Well, I'm not 100% sure, and I'm still trying to figure it out. But here's where my mind goes per your question. So I think imagination is a really, really important concept in childhood play, right? Make believe friends, make believe stuff, this sense of imagination. And from what I've read from Kleber's work and a few other play theorists, that, children that have this rich imaginative life helps with flourishing and coping later in life. And it seems to me that Frankl somehow tapped into his imagination, right? I mean, in the concentration camps. And he tapped back to his childhood, but almost like that childhood imaginative state, right? Where you could see things that aren't there, right? One of the great play theorists of all time is Johann Hutzinger, wrote a book called Homo Ludens, I think in 1938. And so forth. It talks about that sphere, that imaginative sense. And somehow that gets lost in adulthood. And it seems to me, at least with Frankl, he had that imagined state that he used. I mean, I'm speculating, but, he's sick with typhoid. And he imagines the future. With logos, I'm going to put together my book. Right, I'm going to put together the doctor and the soul on these scraps of paper and so forth in an imaginativeness where they can see their future in an imagined way. And that's somehow tapping into the noetic. So I don't know if I answered your question, brother, but that's where my mind went with your question. So what do you think?
So I'm presenting on this idea that I'm calling it meaning play, presenting tomorrow, but I asked because I see a lot of similarities in this the play concept and in this leisure concept. And I pull from Hutzinger's work and a gentleman, Peter Gray, who evolutionary psychologist who studies play. And he talks about it as a state, and so this kind of leisure state in which or this play state, what he say, but on your presentation, kind of this leisure state where work can be leisure or play, and to certain degrees, and maybe it's more work because you've got more deadlines and outside restrictions or whatever it might be. But there's still this leisure aspect of it. This,
And connected to Frankl to discover meaning.
Yeah.
Do we have time for another question or two, or is it time to wrap it up, Savina?
It's basically time to wrap it up already. I mean, it is the last session, so we are not that short of time. So if there's one more pressing question somebody has, please go with it. But other than that, I would slowly start to wrap this wonderful session. And I also want to take the chance to tell you about the networking and connection possibilities we provide with this conference. The one we recommend next is the instant networking session. You find it in the community tab. It's a fun thing to do. You might want to try it out right now. It's available throughout the conference. So you can be in touch with each other and further the discussion. And I will put the link the reminder about the survey in the chat. So we would ask you to complete the survey to help us get better. And now, after having said that, you probably had the chance to think about whether you had one more question that Rodney might want to answer. It's probably too much pressure now on you. Say one more question. yeah, I'd suggest you reach out to Rodney directly if you wanna be in touch or wanna dive deeper into the topic. And as we've heard with Curtis, we have a similar, not a similar, but an adjacent topic tomorrow. So that might be a good idea to further your discussion there. So if it's okay with you, I think we can wrap it for now. And I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. And in a way that wraps up also the first day of our great conference. So I hope you had a good day.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.